Welcome to the third and final part of the first chapter of the Wednesday Wars. So this is your read aloud for Wednesday, March 25th. You need to make sure that you have your September Part 3 questions. And we'll get started. You've got 5 questions today. What did they spend the afternoon doing? What did he see behind Mrs. Baker's eyes? What is Mr. Guareschi's long ambition? What is another dictator of a small country technique? Why did her face never change? We spent the afternoon with English for You and Me, learning how to diagram sentences. So that's number 1. As if there were some reason why anyone in the Western Hemisphere needed to know how to do this. One by one, Mrs. Baker called us up to the blackboard to try our hand at it. Here's the sentence she gave to Merrill Lee. The brook flows down the pretty mountain. Here's the sentence she gave to Danny Hupfer. He kicked the round ball into the goal. Here's the sentence she gave to Mai Thi. The girl walked home. This was so short because it used about a third of Mai Thi's English vocabulary, since she'd only gotten here from Vietnam during the summer. Here's the sentence she gave to Doug Switek. I read a book. There was a different reason why this sentence was so short, never mind that it was a flat-out lie on Doug Switek's part. And here's the sentence she gave me. For it so falls out that what we have we prize not to the worth whiles we enjoy it, but being lacked and lost, why, then we rack the value. Then we find the virtue that possession would not show us while it was ours. No native speaker of the English language could diagram this sentence. The guy who wrote it couldn't diagram the sentence. I stood at the blackboard as hopeless as a grade 7 kid could be. Mr. Hood, said Mrs. Baker. I started to sweat. If Robert Louis Stevenson had written a sentence like that in Treasure Island, no one would have ever read the book, I thought. If you had been listening to my instructions, you should have been able to do this, said Mrs. Baker, which is sort of like saying that if you've ever flicked on a light switch, you should be able to build an atomic reactor. Start with what we have, she said, and smiled at me through her pinched face, and I saw in her eyes what would have been in Long John Silver's eyes if he had ever gotten a hold of Captain Flint's treasure. And that is number 2. But the game wasn't over yet. The PA crackled and screeched like a parrot, and it called my name. It said I was to come to the principal's office. Escape! I put the chalk down. I turned to Mrs. Baker with a song of victory on my lips. But I saw that there was a song of victory on her lips already. Immediately, said the PA, and suddenly I knew it was the police. Mrs. Baker had reported me. It had to be the police. They had come to drag me to the station for taking out Doug Switek's brother. And I knew that my father would never bribe the judge. He'd just look at me and say, "What did you do?" as I headed off to death row. Immediately, Mrs. Baker said. It was a long walk down to the principal's office. It's always a long walk down to the principal's office. And in those first days of school, your sneakers squeak on the waxed floors like you're torturing them. And everyone looks up as you walk by their classroom. And they all know you're going to see Mr. Guareschi in the principal's office. And they're all glad it's you and not them, which it was. I had to wait outside his door. This was to make me nervous. Mr. Guareschi's long ambition had been to become a dictator of a small country. And that is number 3. Danny Hupfer said that he had been waiting for the CIA to get rid of Fidel Castro and then send him down to Cuba, which Mr. Guareschi would then rename Guareschi Land. Merrill Lee said that he was probably holding out for something in Eastern Europe. Maybe he was, but while he waited for his promotion, he kept the job of principal at Camillo Junior High and tested out his dictator of a small country techniques on us. He stayed sitting behind his desk in a chair a lot higher than mine when I was finally called in. Hauling Hood, he said. His voice was high-pitched and a little bit shrill, like he had spent a lot of time standing on balconies screaming speeches through bad PA systems at the multitudes down below who feared him. Hood, I said. It says Halling Hood on this form I'm holding. Well, it says Halling Hood on my birth certificate. Mr. Guarashi smiled his principal smile. Let's not get off on the wrong foot here, Halling. Forms are how we organize this school, and forms are never wrong, are they? That's one of those dictator of a small country techniques at work, in case you missed it. Halling Hood, I said. Thank you, said Mr. Guarashi. He looked down at his form again. But Halling, said Mr. Guarashi, we do have a problem here. This form says that you passed grade 6 math, though with a decidedly below average grade. Yes, I said, of course I passed grade 6 math. Even Doug Switek had passed grade 6 math, and he had grades that were really decidedly below average. Mr. Guarashi picked up a piece of paper from his desk. But I've received a memo from Mrs. Baker wondering whether you would profit by retaking that class. Retake grade 6 math? Perhaps she is not convinced that your skills are sufficiently developed to begin grade 7 math. But do not interrupt, Halling Hood. Mrs. Baker suggests that on Wednesday afternoon, starting at 1:45, you would sit in on Mrs. Harknett's class for their math lesson. Somewhere, there's got to be a place where a grade 7 kid can go and leave the Mrs. Bakers and Mr. Guarashis and Camillo Junior Highs so far behind him that he can't even remember them. Maybe it's on board the Hispaniola, flying before the wind, moored by a tropical island with green palms crowding the mountains, bright tropical flowers, real ones, poking out between them. Or maybe California, which, if I ever get there, you can bet I would find the virtue that possession would show us. But Mr. Guarashi returned to his form and read it over again. He shook his head. According to this record, he said, still reading, you did pass grade 6 math. I nodded. I held my breath. Maybe I could dare to believe that even a dictator of a small country might have a moment of unintended kindness. Mrs. Baker does have a legitimate concern, it would seem, but a passing grade is a passing grade. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to jinx it. You'd better stay where you are for now, he said. I nodded again. But, Mr. Guarashi leaned toward me, I'll double-check your permanent record, Halling Hood. You be prepared for a change, should one be necessary. In case you missed it, that's another one of those dictator of a small country techniques. Always keep everyone off balance. And that is number 4. Mr. Guarashi scribbled over Mrs. Baker's memo. He folded it, then took out an envelope from his desk. Looking at me the whole time, he placed the memo in the envelope, licked the flap, and sealed it. He wrote Mrs. Baker on the outside. Then he handed it to me. Return this to her, he said. The envelope had better be sealed when she receives it. I will make a point of inquiring about it. So I took the envelope, sealed, and carried it back to Mrs. Baker, still sealed. She unsealed it as I sat back down at my seat. She read what Mr. Guarashi had written and slowly placed the letter in the top drawer of her desk. Then she looked up at me. Regrettable. She said all 4 syllables very slowly. She could probably diagram each one if she wanted to. I watched her carefully for the rest of the day, but nothing ever gave away her murderous intentions. She kept her face as still as Mount Rushmore, even when Doug Switek's new pen broke and spread bright blue ink all over his desk, or when the Rand McNally map of the world fell off its hangers as she pulled it down, or even when Mr. Guarashi reported during afternoon announcements that Lieutenant Tybalt Baker would soon be deployed to Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division, and we should all wish him, together with Mrs. Baker, well. Her face never changed once, because that's how it is with people who are plotting something awful. And that's number 5.